International Studies program at FIU. It is my honor to serve as the moderator of the next panel, which brings together scholars with excellent expertise that would help us understand some of the most recent developments, but also challenges facing European policymakers. So the panel focuses on some critical foreign policies of the European Union. In a way, it's a continuation of the previous panel, but now we will pay special attention to three particular areas. One is the area of human rights protection. The second one is climate change policies and the environment. And the third is European foreign and security policies and strategies. So the big question that we are asking ourselves is how can these policies be formulated, rethought, reconsidered, reconstructed, given the fact that we are in a very different situation now, given the context of an ongoing war in Ukraine, and also given the fact that there are far-right forces that are growing in strength in Europe. All these concerns and more about all of them we will hear from our panelists. So let me introduce the three of them the way they are listed in the program. We have Ernesto Fiocchetto, who is an Argentinian sociologist. He started his studies at Florida International University in 2017, and during the time he has spent with us, he accomplished several things. First of all, he got his master's degree in religious studies in 2019, then a master's in international relations in 2021, and a graduate certificate in Latin American studies. He's currently writing his dissertation, on the way to defend it and to become Doctor of International Relations very soon. Now, his research interest, I wanted also to mention something because it is important. He has served at the Miami, Florida Jean Monnet Center of Excellence as a graduate assistant for 4 years. So he has contributed a lot to the program. Ernesto's research interests center on the intersection of migration and asylum, international politics, religion, sexual orientation and gender identity. His current research revolves around multiple aspects of the policies and the issues that I just listed. But for his dissertation work in particular, he studies the agency of faith-based actors in the reception and integration of LGBTQ Latin Americans who claim asylum in the United States and also in Spain. He has published his work in Spanish and English. Our second panelist, Dr. Joan Saltnes, is lecturer and also collaborating researcher at the University of Brasilia in Brazil. She is also affiliated researcher at ARENA, the Center for European Studies, University of Oslo in Norway. Her research looks at the contestation of international norms, with a particular focus on the European Union's external human rights and environmental policies, global justice, and also sanction regimes. Her work has appeared in numerous scholarly journals, such as the Journal of Common Markets, the Journal of European Integration, Cooperation and Conflict, Global Affairs, Politics and Governance, and many others. And our third panelist is Dr. Ioannis Stivaktis, who is Professor of Political Science and Jean Monnet Chair. He is also the director of the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies at Virginia Tech University. His research and teaching interests include international relations theory, international organizations in Europe, including the European Union, NATO, the Council of Europe, European security, European strategy, neighborhood policies of the European Union. He has authored and edited several books, and he has published numerous articles in scholarly journals. He serves as editor of the Critical European Studies book series with Routledge. His current service also includes numerous other activities, as, for example, the acting director of the Center for European and Mediterranean Affairs of the Institute of Education and Research. He has also served different institutions. It's a long list of service that he has, and I'll mention just a few of these so that you can feel the variety of activities that he has been engaged in. For example, he was professor of international relations at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations, professor of international European studies at the American College of Switzerland. He also was a research fellow at the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, and in many other institutions. He has taught in various diplomatic and military academies. So this is in brief our panelists, and let's not waste more time and just give them the floor so that they make their presentations. I suggest that each of them takes about 15 minutes to present, and then we'll open for a questions and answers session. Ernesto.
Good afternoon, and well, thank you, Dr. Thiel and Christine and Kali, for this invitation to take part in this conference. It's an honor to be here. Well, I'm not going to introduce myself again because you already know something about me, but what I'm going to say, because I really want to be very honest, is that I mean, this is the title of the book. I call it Incredible Queer Refugees, and we will use the credibility assessment and the discourses around the credibility assessments of LGBTIQ+ asylum seekers and refugees from Latin America I will take advantage of these discourses to try to delve into the imagination of Latin America from Europe and how this can impact foreign policies. And as I told you, on behalf of academic honesty, this is my fieldwork. This is what I do. I'm looking at some faith-based organizations who are working in the reception and integration of LGBTIQ+ asylum seekers and refugees in the US and Spain. And these are all examples from Spain. You can see the Jesuits there, la Merced Migraciones, Diaconia, that is a Protestant NGO. And so, of course, these are very progressive NGOs working with LGBTIQ+ refugees. Based on my fieldwork, I try to I just try to bring some questions and probably some conclusions about foreign policy in the European Union and how we can imagine, reimagine, and remake it. So just in order to clarify some terms, the refugee status determination, RSD, is the process in deciding whether a person is a refugee or not. So it's when the state says, yes, this person is a refugee, they give them this refugee status determination that determine that they are refugees. And the credibility assessment is the formal process that determines if a person is believable, or the information they are given is trustworthy. If we believe them or not, what they are saying. In general, this comes through like an interview, a personal interview, and they can also write their memories. Well, the techniques are different, and they are different in different countries also. But this credibility assessment is critical to the refugee status determination process. It's a crucial component. Because based on the result of this credibility assessment, the status will be recognized or not. So, the first thing that I want to say is that I speak about migration governance, so I'm not only focusing on the laws and actual policies, because there are at least 3 actors that are very, very important in the Spanish migration governance now. That is the state, civil society organizations, and their faith actors are very, very important because, for a quantitative reason, they are the majority. Most of them are religious organizations. This is replicated around the West, like everywhere. Even here in the US, most of the NGOs working with migrants are faith-based organizations. And also the judiciary system, in particular area where we're going to focus on the courts. That said, if we want to focus on the legal framework, we have to say that Law 12/2009 is the base of this forced migration policy, and now we are speaking about forced migration. They have a different regime for just common migration, let's say. And Law for 2023, also known, probably you listen to this, it's called so-called trans law, because it regulated the rights for transgender people. These 2 components are very important. Then we are going to see another one, because these 2 elements, they make the definition, or they add to the definition of the 1951 Convention. In the definition of particular social group, they include membership of a particular social group, gender, or sexual orientation, or sexual identity. And that is in the law. And so in Spain, there is no discussion about that. Sexual orientation, gender identity can be grounds for refuge, for claiming asylum. What is the most critical shortcomings of this law is the lack of regulatory and procedural development. This is a general law that was supposed to bring new decisions, just to see, how we are going to administer this situation. And there are 2 important points here. First is that Spain didn't focus on migration until the last year, so they didn't care about making a lot of procedural and regulatory development on forced migration, but also that they were waiting for the European Union to make some decisions on the SEAS, and that these discussions took like a while. And now we have the new pact on migration and asylum, and we listened something about it yesterday. I will go back to it at the end of my presentation. Then we have, in 2022, the new legal provisions from the Minister of Inclusion. Then the system is based in 3 parts: the initial assessment and referral phase, which is very important. It's when the person arrives, they claim for asylum, they are registered, and they go through this interview where the credibility assessment is performed. Then we have the reception phase and the autonomy phase, and there you will see this is completely carried out by civil society organizations. Last but not least, the courts that will have a role only if the Ministry of Inclusion and Migration rejects some of the applications. So in that case, the person can appeal to the courts, and these two courts, the National Court and the Supreme Court, in different situations, but both of them are going to be able to change that decision or not. So consequently, while the ultimately responsible for asylum is the national state, it outsources a significant part of the asylum system to civil society organizations, especially religious-based organizations, leaving little or no space to another actor, which is important, that is the autonomous communities, provinces, municipalities, and islands. And here we have the first problem. Because, I mean, exactly the same that we are living in the US, which is not ruled by the national government, at some point is ruled by the, in this case, the autonomous communities. So they cannot provide legislation on migration, but they can do that in education, in health, in social services, and this is how they are trying to challenge some of the of the possibilities of integration of LGBTIQ+ refugees. I just wrote here the example of Madrid and these negotiations between the Popular Party and Vox, a very right-wing party, that are always pushing for, they have like an anti-gender, anti-migration agenda. So, time is flying. When I analyzed the discourses of the court, I will read just quickly some lines about what I have. These are two cases, one from Cuba, one from Ecuador. I quote, "To our knowledge, Ecuador does not have legislation that specifically criminalizes such situations. Situations is being a homosexual, or at least, period. No? So Ecuador does not have the legislation that criminalizes homosexuality." The other quote, "While the applicant insists that Cuban legislation punishes homosexual conduct, a report in the case files shows that there is greater tolerance towards such practices nowadays." These are the arguments, some of the arguments they use to reject the application. What can we say about that? In the refugee status determination, we have two elements, the objective element and the subjective element. The objective element has to do with the country of origin, and basically what they are saying is if there are not criminalizing legislation enforced by the states, there is no ground for the application. And also, if there is an LGBTIQ+ local community, they shouldn't have problems, because if there is an LGBTQ group, it's because they are accepted. Most of the people who need to flee are part of these groups. And the subjective element is the evidence that they have fear of persecution. They speak about mere harassment when it has, the persecution has a social connotation, and when it is, the violence is exerted by a non-state actor, they claim that there has to be some kind of complicity of the state's actors. And here I think that there is something interesting, we will see why. There is also, I call an intersectional approach to credibility, because religion here doesn't count. Because we are speaking about Christian countries, let's say. Now, I don't like that terminology, but Latin America has like a Christian matrix. If you're coming from the MENA region, from the Middle East and North Africa, there is an imagination that Islam is against LGBTIQ+ people. But that's not happening with Latin America. If you're in Latin America, there are no cultural problems there. That gives us an imagination of the Northwest and a process of othering of the East and the South. And the problem is that Latin America is in the Southwest. So it is us and it is the others as well. So I'm not going to go deep here, but I think one of the most important things here is that Europe needs to address a discourse on the memory of asylum in Europe. And you will be surprised to see how many Europeans were asylees, are refugees in Latin America. And I'm not speaking of 1492. I'm speaking about the 20th century. But we forget about that when we speak about migration and refugees in Europe. Latin America is part of the global south. What's the most important problem of the global south? Poverty. So in the imagination, these people are economic migrants and bogus refugees. They pretend to be refugees, they make up these excuses, but the problem is that they are poor. But as part of the West, Latin America is supposed to be developed, supposed to be progressive, supposed to be shaped by Europe, because these people who flee Europe to Latin America, they are not refugees, they didn't want asylum, they were just building our civilization. No, this is the narrative at the end, no? So the legal standards should be very similar than we are. We can focus on that to decide. And the other point is, I already told that, Christianity. They are as Christian as we are. We have similar values, so there shouldn't be a lot of problem there with people. What is the point here is that is this a problem of the courts or is this a problem of the European society? And my claim is this, the courts are part of this society that is shaped by this imagination and by these discourses. I quoted here an exception of the faith actors that I work with, because in general we read just the first part, no? That belonging to LGBTI plus collective is criminalized in 72 countries, all of them or most of them, Muslim majority countries. But there is another part there that the courts are not taking into consideration, and most of the civil society organization is not taking into consideration. That's why I say this is an example. Because in other parts of the world, this persecution comes directly through civil society. And this is something that we need to take into consideration. Can I take one more minute? Yes, sure. Okay, so now we have the new part on migration and asylum. For now, it's just a political agreement. Unfortunately, I cannot go deep. It's huge, but I will say just a couple of things that I think could help for the European foreign policy. The first one is that there are some new screen regulations that I'm not very optimistic about them. But after the screening, they will have this border procedure. That is that when the person seems to be like in some kind of irregular situation, they will go through a fast process. Otherwise, they go to jail and to detention. And the other problems here is that they are not. They are supposed not to. They are not in Europe already, even when they are there. No? They are not supposed to have entered Europe. So that leaves these people in a very, very risky situation. I think that if we think of this imagination that we have been discussing, I think first we need to train our officers to overcome the legalistic view, or the legalistic perspective in the decisions they make. And they need to be able to make exceptions. It's not the same a man, a woman, a transgender person, a kid, a boy, a girl. For now, nothing is said about that. Second point, what is a safe country? What is a safe third country? And the problem is here that this will be left to the discretion of the member states. And here, foreign policy is critical, because what they are thinking is that if we have a deal with a country, that makes the country a safe place. And we have the recent EU-Tunisia deal, for example. Is Tunisia a safe country? Well, for sure it is for many people, but it is not for many other people. And this is something that when we speak about safety, we need to consider. Countries are safe for some people and maybe not that safe for other people. That is something that it's also need to be considered. And about durable solutions, we keep working with the 3 solutions that we have from the Geneva Convention, but there are also alternative pathways, and I don't have time. If you ask this, I'll be happy to answer. But what I just want to say is that what the states are not doing because they don't want to or they can't, civil society organization is taking action. And there are a lot of examples where they find new pathways, not always legal, but effective, to help these LGBTI plus refugees from Latin America. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ernesto. Now,
Hi everyone, good afternoon. First I wanted to thank Marcus and his team for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here, honored. I also want to thank the other panelists for very fruitful discussions this morning, insightful discussions. We heard a lot about partnerships today. Being an ally, being a partner in the Council Roundtable, we heard about the EU being a real and equal partner for countries in the Global South. What I want to tell you today is a story about how that is somehow sometimes very difficult, and give you some nuances to why these partnerships, I wouldn't say fail, perhaps that is a too strong word, but why there are challenges for the EU to create those partnerships and to be the real and equal partner. How do I, is it like this? Yes. So, where do we start? We start with the EU's environmental policies. We also talked about the Green Deal today. We heard some people talk about the Green Deal. It's not news to anyone that the climate crisis is here. The climate crisis is competing with a lot of other crises for Europe's attention. Still, the EU claims to be a green environmental leader. It has been called a green normative power. It has been called international leader in the global environmental governance. And in February 2024, we saw the very ambitious goal of, or the intent of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 90% compared to 1990 levels before 2040. This is a very ambitious goal. The Green Deal is presented like this by the EU on their web pages, striving to be the first climate neutral continent in the world. So there is no lack of ambition here, as you can see. Perhaps the most talked about, so there is one internal dimension in the Green Deal, and there is an external dimension. The internal dimension goes for the European continent, what European member states are doing for themselves. Then we have the external dimensions, which affect European foreign policy and relations to countries around the world. The most talked about initiative these days is the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which seeks to set a price on carbon emission intensive goods produced outside of the EU. This is not what I'm talking about today. I'm going to talk about a different initiative, which is the 2019 plan for stepping up EU action to protect and restore the world's forest. It has 3 main ambitions or 3 main aims, this policy or this strategy. It is, first of all, to reduce the footprint of EU consumption on land and encourage the consumption of products from deforestation-free value chains, as it's called. It is to be a partner with producer countries to reduce the pressures on forests around the world. And it's also what the EU says, deforest-proof EU development cooperation. So, within this larger 2019 plan, there is one EU regulation that has got a lot of attention lately, which is the EU Deforestation Regulation, which you might have heard about. This regulation seeks to prevent companies from placing commodities on the European market that are linked with deforestation and forest degradation. This regulation is now in what we call the transition period, so it's already adopted. There is an 18-month transition period where producers are supposed to adapt to the new regulation, and then all the requirements will go into force in December of this year. So what do producers have to do to follow this regulation? People who want to export their products to the European market. There are really three criteria that has to be met. First of all, commodities have to be deforestation free. So what does this mean? The EU has defined what this means to be deforestation free. It means that the EU has set a cut-off date, which is December 2020, and whatever the products that are produced and that they want to export to the EU market cannot have been produced on lands where therefore deforestation has happened after this cut-off date. So there is a particular moment in time, retroactively, going back to 2020, where products need to be shown that they are deforestation free. They also have to be in line with national laws and international human rights regulations. And the third requirement is that operators will have to provide what we call a due diligence statement with the products that they export to the EU. So this means that they have to declare whether there is no risk or negligible risk of deforestation with their products, also with geolocation indicators. There will also be a benchmarking system developed by the EU, which puts different countries into low risk, high risk, and standard risk. So the EU claims that everybody will start out in the standard risk, and then they might move different countries into high risk or lower risk, which if you're in the higher risk category, that means more controls and more checks on your products. For the EU, which I tried to show you here with a little graph, which is from EU promotional material, for the EU, the deforestation regulation is really grounded in a citizens' initiative from European citizens, and this is a regulation that is justified to give European citizens greener produce or greener products. So the first kind of justification for it is to please European citizens because they want to know what they are eating, where it comes from, and that the products they are consuming have not contributed to deforestation. So there is a strong link with this initiative to the European citizen and what the European citizen wants. So let us now go to Brazil, which is what I really want to talk to you about. You can see here von der Leyen and Lula from von der Leyen's visit to Brazil in May 23, and it seems like they're having the greatest time and discussing a beautiful partnership. But this was not what was happening behind the press conference. There are several things that complicates the relationship between the EU and Brazil at the moment. We have the EU-Mercosur agreement, which has been very contested, and Europe has kind of put a proposition forward on a side instrument with stronger environmental requirements, which Brazil and the other Mercosur countries have been very skeptical about. So relations between Brazil and the EU are conflicting on many different points. So Lula on his side is, as many of you would know, he is a politician in Brazil that has been fighting deforestation for a long time. He has a strategy in place. He reduced deforestation in his former presidency, and as soon as he got back to the presidential seat, he pledged that Brazil would work towards zero deforestation before 2030. He said that at the COP27, he repeated it at the COP28. So it seems like the EU and Lula is somehow on the same page here to begin with. So why was this deforestation regulation so contested in Brazil? This is the question that I've been asking and I've been studying together with some colleagues at the university in Brazil. So this is not only my work, I want to credit my co-authors as well. It's work in progress, still not published, but yeah, it's coming out hopefully in the next year. I just put some quotes there for you to see how it was contested right in the beginning when it was launched 8 months ago. EPAM is a research institute on the Amazon, and one representative there said it's more about getting rid of the problem than solving it. Carlos Favaro is the agricultural minister in Brazil. He's been one of the most vocal contestants of the regulation. He called it an affront to international trading. It harms Brazilian sovereignty and it will not be affected. There was also a joint letter to the EU by 17 ambassadors from the Global South, calling the benchmarking system inherently discriminatory and punitive unilateral. I can't see the rest of the quote there. It kind of escaped me. Unilateral instrument or something like this. So we have studied how this regulation was perceived in 3 main groups in Brazil. So the first group is policymakers, diplomats, bureaucrats, so kind of the political sphere. We have talked to producers who are in the who produce the products that are affected by the regulation. So mainly beef and soy in Brazil. The regulation doesn't affect all products. It's a certain category of products. And then we also talk to civil society representatives about their perceptions. It's not only contestings, there are also some positive views, so that's important to say. But yeah, I want to tell you a little bit more on the nuance on this contestation. Why is it so contested? Why is this regulation so contested in Brazil? So we started off with kind of 3 hypotheses. The first one is about efficiency. Was it really that just the regulation wasn't the right instrument? It wouldn't reach the goals that it set. The second hypothesis was about validity. Was it the zero deforestation element that was the problem? That Brazil didn't, or these Brazilian actors didn't agree with that? Maybe they wanted another competing norm like sustainable forests that didn't have this zero element in it? Or was it really about the process? Was it something about how the EU went about or how the EU was behaving when it promoted this regulation in Brazil? So what did we find? I mean, empirics is always messy. There is a little bit of everything, but there was also a clear pattern in what we found. Efficiency, yes. There was some concerns about efficiency, but it wasn't really what was most important. The concerns about efficiency was about the first element was about this definition of other wooded lands not being included. So the EU deforestation regulation concerns what we call tropical forests, and it does not concern what is called other tropical lands. So tropical savanna, for example, the Cerrado in Brazil. So it goes for what we define as the Amazon, but not for the Cerrado. So there was a lot of both European and Brazilian civil society groups who wanted to add these other wooded lands into the regulation. If not, they thought that deforestation might just be moved from the areas that was included to the areas that weren't included. So this is clearly kind of an efficiency consideration. Then there were concerns about market leakage to China, that many of the producers would just export their products to other countries that are more willing to or have less requirements into the markets. So they would stop exporting beef to Europe and they would export all their beef to China, where there is a huge market for Brazilian beef. Also, some people are concerned about that. But it wasn't really the main issue. Was it about validity? Well, there were also some concerns about the validity, but it wasn't kind of the main issue either. Some people highlighted that it was more about cleaning the European market than really the overall aim of reducing deforestation. another point that really is important and that is coming up a lot is that the EUDR prohibits all types of deforestation. In the Brazilian Forest Code, you have a distinguishment between legal and illegal deforestation, which means that all farmers or all landowners commit to taking or leaving 80% of their land without exploiting that land, and then they can use 20% of their land for farming and deforest that 20%. This is a law that has been in place in Brazil for many, many years, and many producers see this as a well-functioning way of actually taking care of large parts of the forest. So we see here the zero element is a little bit contested, overlooking the Brazilian way of doing it, which too many people has worked in favor of conservation of forests. The civil society, I have to say, was very in line with Europe here and very negative to the landowners' arguments, so there are also some nuances here and some contestation with it. What we really found, though, was that the process and how the EU went about when it was doing this, that was the main thing that the actors contested. So, first of all, there was highlighted that the EU went about this with a very unilateral character. So this was a legislative initiative coming from the EU, and it did not go via multilateral channels, right? So it regulates the EU market, so they are allowed to do it in the unilateral way. Still, it is a policy that has a lot of consequences for producing countries, for other countries. So this unilateral way of legislating was highlighted as the main problem. And there was lack of dialogue on a set of key issues in the regulation that many different groups contested. So, first of all, stakeholders pointed out that it was very difficult to discuss the initiative with the EU. The definitions in the regulation were not discussed or agreed upon, for example, the retroactive cutoff date of 2020. And then the EU defined transition period, which is the 18 months that the producers have in their hands to kind of adopt to this, was also something that the EU decided, and that was not discussed with the countries that actually have to comply with it. So many of the people that we talked to, they pointed to the lack of a cooperative and dialoguing intent of the EU. Many of them point to the Principle 12 of the Rio Declaration, which states that states should cooperate and promote a supportive and open international system. Unilateral actions to deal with environmental challenges should be avoided. So there is kind of a one-size-fits-all approach from the EU that fails to take in the considerations of each of the other producer countries and also makes them think that it is unfair, or perhaps if they had been willing to dialogue, there could be adjustments made to make this more easier also for the producing countries. I'm finishing. Here are some quotes from the interviews. I'm not going to read you this because I don't have time, but I want to talk about a few lessons of this study for EU foreign policy. So, as I said in the beginning, we talked about a lot today about partnership. What does it mean to be a good partner? We had several people here representing the EU saying we are real and equal partners to the Global South, right? So, if partnership is what the EU wants, I think they have to take into account that process is a key of being a real and equal partner. It's not only about the shared values. You can have many shared values, but if you don't go about it in a way that is legitimate and is dialoguing with the partner, it might be that you end up on different paths anyway. So a just and effective foreign policy requires a due hearing of partners. And this reminds us of what the Frankfurter School in political philosophy says. So Rainer Forst and Sela Ben-Aviv, they talk about a structure of justification, the right to justification. If you want a real partnership, you need to be able to to deliberation and dialoguing with your partners on your policies. And it seems like the EU has not done its job here. So while the democratic procedures within the EU might be better, for example, given the link to the EUDR to the citizens, this was a policy that was demanded by their citizens. It seems like the EU is listening to what their citizens want. It might be that this better democratic procedures within the EU is happening without giving the same due hearing to the partners, or even giving a worse kind of treatment to the partners than what they're doing to their own citizens. So if they fail to employ these similar procedures to those who are receiving the EU's policies, then that might have significant effects. And I think also it might harm the willingness of the EU's partners to engage with them in a lot of other areas as well. This is not something that is only connected to environmental governance, but this is something that the EU needs to reflect upon also for being a partner in many other areas. Yes, I think I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Thiel for inviting me. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here. I'd like also to thank Christine, and I apologize for all the pain I caused you with the paperwork. That was not my intention. I'm not going to use all my PowerPoints because there are many slides. But I'd like to start explaining to you where I come from. And I don't mean the country I was born. I'm an English school scholar. And one of the projects of the Classical English School of International Relations is about the evolution of international society. The main argument is that European states compose a regional international society which through the European travels expanded outwards and was gradually transformed into the global international society of the late 20th century or 21st century. Within the global international society, after the end of the Cold War, we can find some more homogeneous regional international societies. And the reconvened English School emphasizes the European Union as forming a regional international society. And my work, my late work, emphasizes or tries to compare the historical expansion of Europe with the enlargement of the European Union and the policy of the European Union as they say the EU's neighborhood and its relation to the global south. I do that by going back to my initial research because the main question about the evolution of international society was how non-European states could join the expanded European international society. And the answer in the second part of the 19th century was by fulfilling the standard of civilization. So, I would like to see the contents of the historical standard of civilization. In my initial research, I investigated how Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and most importantly Greece, joined the European International Society. But then later on, I came across certain rhetoric by European Union leaders that made me think, uh-oh, I have read these things somewhere before. I have heard these things somewhere before. So that was I tried to do, and that's what brought me into European studies. For instance, in 2007, Nicolas Sarkozy, president of the French Republic, tried to explain why Turkey should not be part of Europe. Of course, some people emphasize only one sentence in his speech, that geographically Turkey is not part of Europe. If we agree with that, then we can say that even Turkey would be the more democratic country in the world, more than the European Union countries, they could not be part of Europe. But Nicolas Sarkozy said other things too, in the same interview. Turkey has no place in Europe. What's the idea behind Europe? Europe is a union of European countries. Can Turkey be regarded a European country culturally, historically, and economically speaking? If we say that, we want the European Union's death. Later on, the year José Barroso, the president of the European Commission back then, called the European Union a non-imperial empire. This invited lots of discussion about EU as a polity internally, but also how it is related with the rest of the world, and what kind of aspects of power are embedded in the concept of imperialism. In fact, imperialism was regarded as having a progressive as well as a regressive type of nature. And European Union was more the progressive style, but I come back to that later. Not to mention, of course, in 2022, that the High Representative of European Union's Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Josep Borrell, comes up with his famous speech about the garden and the jungle. I'm grateful to my colleagues yesterday evening that reminded me or told me that this speech was given several times before. I don't know if this is good or bad, but other colleagues that they have been in Brussels told me that other people in Brussels in the European Commission shared these ideas. So, all these nice things we hear about the European Union is exactly what happens. Is the High Representative, does the High Representative represent this kind of European Union? What would have happened if a foreign minister has said that? But nothing happens. But also observe some issues, the way the European Union tried to deal with its neighborhood through the European neighborhood policy, especially the south part rather than the eastern part, which led to revision of 2011, 2015, and hopefully not anymore. The basic issue is what my colleague just before explained to you. It's not what the European Union tries to do, but the way it does. The neighborhood is, according to the European Security Strategy of 2003, extremely important to the European Union. Its security depends on what happens in the neighborhood. But when the European Union goes out to tell the others what their problems are and how they are going to be solved. And this partnership is a nice word, but partnerships can be very asymmetrical and very unequal, as marriages can be as well. And marriages lead also to divorces, if there's high inequality. But something similar things can be observed in the Eurasian relations, where they try to manage the common European space. So, I wanted to, now since you have probably time to go through, I want to point out that the start of civilization reflected a long and continuing process which tended to lead to greater homogeneity among states. The standard of civilization was insulting to representatives of non-European civilizations, and they view it as an unjust system of domination and exploitation. It was also perceived as denying equal rights to the political communities of Africa, Asia, and Oceania. Most importantly, the standard reflected the norms of European civilization. European states define what constitutes civilized norms and practices. What are the basic rights involved in the status of civilization were not clearly defined. Sometimes even European states themselves did not observe their own standards. But also the standard became a moving target, which allowed the European states to push for further and further reforms before they decide to accord a non-European state a civilized status. Now, even after the end of World War II, the practice of civilized states became a source of international law. And you can see it in the Charter of the International Criminal Court. During the negotiations for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Law Commission says that only the constitutions of civilized states may be taken into account in order to define what universal human rights are. And of course the question becomes in 1948, how can be universal when we had colonial empires, and colonial empire was taken on behalf of states that became independent in the 60s and 70s. The revolt against the West in the 60s and 70s led eventually to the abolition of the standard of civilization. Everybody agreed, that's an anathema, should not have never been happened. Now we have learned, have we? It has been argued that the creation of global order was a Western project following World War II. And the global international order in the work of Mehdi Jafari and David Fielder was to be based in a global standard of civilization. Benjamin Kingsbury also divided the world between two zones, the liberal and non-liberal zone. The liberal zone consists of individual liberal states practicing a higher degree of legal standards, and that the liberal West is the vanguard of a transformed legal global order that contains a new standard of civilization to promote the advancement of the backwards. And then David Fielder comes and tells us that the new standard of civilization includes the following things: democracy, human rights, the rule of law, good governance, market liberalization, and structural adjustment policies. And he compares the historical standard of civilization with what we call conditionality, and finds out that these are very close to each other. So the question is, do we know what happened before, or do we ignore it? But if we know what happened before, then what we do is we replant some practices with a new name, conditionality. But probably is a new way of saying a standard of civilization. And political and economic conditionality, whether in practiced by the European Union, but not only, IMF for instance as well, is an instrument that can be used to have transformative effects. So, to be within the time limit, because Professor Kostadinova will be very mad at me, I try to argue, or my research is all about, how conditionality is used and applied in EU enlargement, try to transform states to look like European states. As the historical European international society and the standard of civilization want to create states that look like European states in order to be civilized states, in order to have legal recognition. And of course, we have the instruments of power, civilian power in Europe, normative power in Europe, imperial power in Europe, civilizing power in Europe. No military power, but power nevertheless. Different means of achieving certain strategic objectives. I can go a bit. Because Romano Prodi used in 2000, I think, the concept of civil power, that Europe has to become a global civil power. Usually we understand, or initially we understand Europe as a civilian power. But this points out to the centrality of economic power to achieve strategic goals for the European Union, but also François Dussen tells us that the European Union is willing to use legally binding supranational institutions to achieve international progress. That sounds good, but who defines what progress is? Those who advocated or emphasize the power of Europe as an imperial power used examples like the relation between EU and ACP countries to point out that there is a kind of hierarchical, a center-periphery relationship between the EU from one side and ACP countries on the other, that asymmetrical, inequality types of relationships, dependency on one side or the other, and sometimes exploitation. But also, sometimes have attraction. And that's why we have the carrot sticks policy. The carrots are attractive, but if things are not done, the sticks come into play. Fourier identifies, as I mentioned before, two types of imperialism. The regressive, what we understand imperialism in the negative way, but argues that European Union actions are associated with progressive imperialism, a concept that is founded upon a cosmopolitan view of humanity that advocates the spread of civilization to allegedly backward societies, which brings us very close to what José Borrell tried to argue. And we do that in order to improve the living standards and promote civil and political liberties in territories lying beyond the legal boundaries of the imperial polity. And this comes also very close to a mission that Jan Zenon argues that the EU promotes and calls it the mission civilatrice. Hans Moll moves or bridges the concept of civilian power to civilizing power by arguing that the EU is an actor whose conception of its foreign policy role and behavior is bound to particular aims, values, and principles, as well as force of influence and instruments of power in the name of a civilization. And also, again, Zenon moves that, follows this logic, and so is Johann Halki. And going back to stay within the time limits, we have the EU enlargement, and that's what I mean reminiscent of the past. You have the Copenhagen criteria, which has been argued are very similar to the standard of civilization. The European Commission now is the monitoring mechanism. In the old standard of civilization, we have the international lawyers. International lawyers were moving country to country, taking boxes and seeing who has fulfilled the standard or parts of the standard. The European Commission does that through conditionality. And of course, the conditionality itself is the instrument that has transformative effects. But also, conditionality becomes a moving standard, as the standard of civilization before. It has allowed the EU to push for further and further reforms before they decide to offer a candidate state membership. You have Western Balkan countries, you have Turkey, and you try to apply conditionality. No, we're not there, then we'll not be there, that's not ready, we have to go there. And suddenly, for political reasons, Ukraine has to come in. a country that's in the war. Unbelievable. So political considerations take priority. But then the question is, what will happen with the Western Balkan countries or Turkey? And then the question is, are they going to de-Europeanize? And if they are de-Europeanized, what will be the impact on democracy in Europe? Well, that's the impact. If you excuse politically something, which makes sense politically, but has implications for those who have been there before. And I finish with something here. The Soviet Union played an important role during the decolonization process, supporting them. After 1990, Russia was not in a position to help. China, for political reasons, didn't want to be considered as a great power, because the great power concept was for Beijing something difficult to deal with, because they didn't want the global south to consider China as a power in the way they considered great powers before. So they refused. But China is a power that we have to deal with. And what happens at this moment in Ukraine has brought Russia into the forefront again, which gave more and more opportunities to countries in the global south to say no to the West, or some no's to the West, because they couldn't silence it before. Now they see some alternatives. And they see BRICS also as a way, as a means to achieve their objectives. So this is a very important moment in modern world history, because a new revolt of the West may be around the corner, if not started yet. And I'd like to stop here, and I don't know if I stay with my time, but Professor Kostadinova was very kind. Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay. So there were some provocative ideas, and I expect to see many hands raised with questions.
Well, can I just quickly start?
Professor.
I think everybody, thank you.
Can you hear me? Hello. Thank you for the presentations. I have a question more towards, Johan in that case, because I know Ernesto's work pretty well, but maybe you have something to add to that too, and to Professor Sarnes, of course, and Professor Stylianides, and that's something that's been implicit already the whole day long, and that is sort of the EU's ambivalent role in third countries, right, in competition to other major geopolitical powers that you just alluded to, right, that are revolved against the West. In your specific fields of expertise, what leverage does the EU have to fundamentally change these power dynamics if there are other geopolitical competitors that may not have the same normative, ethical, let's say, issues about their interaction with third countries, such as Brazil or in the neighborhood? Was that clear?
Okay, thank you for that question. Very interesting question. I think the plus side of the environmental crisis, there are not many plus sides to it, but the plus side is that it affects everyone. So everybody has to do something. And China is, of course, also doing a lot for climate change, or to revert climate change. And I think what the EU at least tries to do is to set some standards that they hope other powers also will follow. And that happened with the EU timber regulation. And China set not the same standards, but they kind of made a kind of a copy. It's not a copy, it's not completely the same, but they implemented a little bit later than the EU some type of similar legislation. So I think the EU, I'm not sure it's leverage, but I think the EU knows that they will have China on board somehow, and other powers in the world, and with specific regards to deforestation, I think all powers in the world understands that this is a problem we have to deal with at some point and somehow. So I think that's what the EU thinks. That's their strategy. Going ahead, being strong, upping the environmental regulations, and then hoping that other powers will follow. I'm not sure if it's effective, but I think that's their strategy.
And also do that, I guess, through international organizations, right?
Of course, yeah. And they tried, they tried the multilateral way. The Kyoto Protocol was very strict, but nobody signed up to it. Then we had the SDGs, right, which was a bottom-up process. Every country could set their own targets, but the targets weren't high enough for the EU. And now we see a new wave of top-down. The EUDR it's a unilateral thing. It's not even a top-down, it's a unilateral thing. It's a third way almost to upping the standard and setting stricter standards. So instead of discussing it with everybody else, they just simply say, if you want to export to the EU, this is what you have to do, deal with it, or I don't know, we don't want your product. So it's a radical kind of new way to deal with things. But for the EU, the bottom-up process is not, it's not good enough, it's not quick enough, it's not, the standards are not high enough. So this is their way to say, okay, let's try this way and see if that works.
Okay, I'm getting older and I forget names and places. But there was an occasion, I think it was a year ago, where a representative of the German government went somewhere in Africa and complained to the president of the country why there are so many Chinese around. And the response of the African president, I don't remember the country, was that it's true. My question to you is, why don't you see Germans around? So, the question is why the Chinese are there, but why the Germans are not there? You know, it's the way, the perceptions, and how those perceptions are expressing questions and addressing issues, which becomes problematic. Now, I believe that countries that would like to have a relationship with the European Union, but they like to have a more symmetrical, more equal partnership, to be heard, to be understood. They don't like naming and shaming in public. Probably it's much easier for their own approach to politics to be told behind the closed doors and keep that behind the closed doors instead of being very open. But also, they don't like that some things come with strings attached. Something that the Chinese usually, Russians do not do. And this is a choice that they have, and that's how the European Union has to deal with it. It's a policy question, but now they do have a choice. Until recently, probably they didn't.
I don't think I need the microphone. I think I can just project.
Yes.
So these are really, really interesting presentations, and at first glance they seem to be, quite disparate. But I really felt there was a sort of a palpable thread across the presentations, and that you're all grappling with effectively sort of geocultural imaginaries presenting in very specific policy spaces, enlargement policy, environmental policy, and migration policy. But through all of them, there's this implicit civilizationalism and presumption of civilizational primacy at play. But then in the different issue areas, the sort of the ability to project that unreflexively is, in migration policy, there's not much impetus to, especially vis-a-vis LGBTQ migration, there's not, there's not so many alternatives, right? So it's more hegemonic in that space. And then in the Brazilian context and the environmental context, you're describing sort of different strategies and modes of interaction in which maybe there's also more scope because the EU ultimately, if the crisis is to be addressed, you need multiple actors on board and multiple scales, and then I guess my question is for Johannes in that context. So when it comes to you evoked the idea of the revolt against the West, this sort of revolt against the legacies of this geocultural imaginary that reproduces standards that have to be met, that are Eurocentric or unilateral, and yet we've been talking all day about global power shift and the multipolar moment. We see this could lead to potential revolt against the West. In a way, could we conceptualize, say, Russian or Chinese attempts at power projection, Turkish, after being sort of considered disqualified according to the standard of civilization, Turkey's neo-Ottoman power projection in various places, as articulation of alternative standards of civilization to which other regional formations are being invited to participate, in which the other is Europe. So Turkey reimagining, recentering sort of the post-Ottoman geography, including Africa as well, also being a player in this African context, and the Middle East and the Caucasus and the Western Balkans as spaces for power projection. Russia reimagining an alternative standard of civilization, but of Russian civilization as the sort of the primary marker, and China reimagining the form of sort of some people talk about a sort of neo-tribute system and so forth. But in this context where, so there's a dissonance, right, between the geocultural imagination of primacy and unilateralism and the active process of reimagining regional or multi-regional or even global scale standards of civilizations that emanate from other, I call them revisionist former empires, right? So not sort of these other greater Eurasian empires. So in this context, though, you still have African countries or Latin American countries that are on the receiving end of all of this, right? So my question is there reflexivity in the EU at all as to what happens in a multilateral context where your standard of civilization, where people just aren't buying it anymore, on one hand, and on the other hand, what alternatives exist for, is there just a pluralization of choices then for African interlocutors or Latin American interlocutors, or is it, and you can play the Chinese and the European kind of standards of civilization off each other? Or is there some other alternative that we can imagine that is actually more pluriversal to the decolonial intervention we had this morning, in which the end of Eurocentrism doesn't have to be the reinscription of multiple forms of civilizational centrisms being imposed on regional configurations. Anyway, that was kind of stream consciousness, but just throwing that out there.
Secondly, there's a strategic choice to have an identity based on civilization. If the European Union does that, automatically that's in opposition to something else. The opposition to something else may do exactly that as a way to have a strategic identity which has been created by somebody else. Now, in the case of Russia, once you go back and remember well that Russia declared itself as the successor of the Byzantine Empire. The question is why the Byzantine Empire has been the longest and one of the most successful empires in history has not been studied exclusively very much. How many departments of history, dealing with the Byzantine Empire? There's a reason for that. There's a reason going back to the schism between East and West. And of course, everything is done well, happens in the West, as opposed to this Byzantine Empire, dirty politics, blah, blah. But that's not the case. It's a misreading of history for political reasons. And Russia uses this civilization identity now as a Christian nation with certain conservative values. China may do the same thing. The question is, why do we need to portray that we are the civilized ones? And therefore, if you want to join us, you have to do whatever we are. Can be done without. But there's an identity that the panel before we spoke about our values, our norms, to share. Why do we need to share? The others will come probably to share themselves. But the idea of we like to share implies democracy and value promotion. Correct? This is where the problem begins. Sharing doesn't mean really, we love you, come to share, everything is fine. It's a difference, it's a policy. We want the others to get it. And that's the problem for me. It's, again, that we do things in non-appropriate way. We're going to achieve our objectives without doing it in this way. But we have to sell ourselves as being this thing, and the others are not. That's my opinion. And I think that's what diplomacy is, to deal with somebody who is different, somebody who is totally the rival, whatever. Otherwise, what's the problem? To have diplomacy, if everybody's the same and they have the same values and norms, why do we need diplomacy?
Any reactions?
Can I add something
Before
else?
you ask some questions.
Yes. Yes.
Well, this is a question that I think was already. This is a question that was similar to one of the questions already asked, but I wanted to ask, based on what was said about the Brazilian contestation to the EU, so the European Green Deal, right? What can the EU do to improve this? Because as it was said, the UDR will appear now at the end of December. So also, do you think that if that will really help, or it will just be another regulation about an environmental issue, well, basically deforestation?
Thank you for that question. It will definitely happen, and from December this year, nobody will be able to export unless they have the statements that the regulation requires. So it will definitely happen. What I think the EU can have done, or what the EU can do differently in creating a regulation that finds more legitimacy and resonance with the countries that it affects, is that it can go about it in a different way. It could have dialogue, it could have discussed with both policymakers, civil society, and the producers in the policy-making process. The EU dialogued a lot with civil society organizations in the EU. It did not dialogue so much with civil society organizations in the countries where the policy was, in the country that is affected, the producer countries, to say it that way. So I think the EU has a long way to go, and the EU claims to be a dialoguing actor, right? It says multiple stakeholders is always a part of our policy development. It claims to be a partner that is actually dialoguing with its partners. So, and I think this is an example where the EU has failed tremendously to being a dialoguing partner, both with diplomats, with the policymakers, and with other affected parties. So I think the shared value is there between Brazil and the EU on the aim of the policy, and I think they have gone about it the wrong way. And I think also they could have made it perhaps less one size fits all. It could have allowed for some regional nuances or some flexibilities in the regulation that would have helped it be more adjusted to the different parts of the world. It's not only Brazil that has tropical forests. There are large tropical forests in Congo, Indonesia. There are many countries, and the EU deputy mentioned yesterday the difficult dialogue with Indonesia on this, and I think Indonesia has been even more outspoken than Brazil on the issues with the regulation. So I think it's both an element of dialogue, and it's also an element of flexibility and making it more fit to the needs of those who are affected from it. So it's perhaps two things.
There was one other question.
I had another question, but I would defer to the students if they have another question. It was just, I thinking about, I wanted to ask a question to Ernesto because I enjoyed your presentation so much. And it's so tight that it's almost flawless. So there's, that's why it's hard to come up with a probing question because you've really conceptualized it so formatively and operationalized it empirically in such an interesting fashion. So I guess it's just more kind of an open kind of invitation. I was interested. I was struck in your title that you have both LGBTQI plus subjects of your research, but then you also talked of there's also your word queerness, right, in the title. Since the part of your presentation you couldn't get at was about these sort of constituent categories of how we think about like safe country. And what is safety? I was wondering if you could kind of, I think the presentation focused a bit more on sort of the LGBTQI kind of component of your research agenda, but when you queer that and you queer the notion of the safety from, at this intersection of migration and sort of gender studies that you're working at, what do we learn from a queer perspective on safety?
Well, thank you very much for the question, for your comments also. It's a tricky question, and I try to, I mean, it's tricky because when we try to look through queer lenses, or queer lens, I mean, my theoretical perspective, I speak about international queer theoretical perspective. When I get intersectionality and queer lens, definitions are a problem in themselves, because I mean, when I make a definition, I try to write a boundary, and the base of queer theory is to challenge boundaries, but at the same time, we have the problem that with this I'm saying nothing. Everything can be safe or unsafe. And here I would like to take some of the arguments that were discussed in the panel on feminist foreign policy, because I think that the problem is who is making the question and who is answering the question. I think that's the point. If safety is going to be defined by the European Union, now speaking about forced migration policies, for sure we will have some answers. I mean, we have discussed some of the answers in my presentation. We could add some other points, but for sure it will be based, I mean, safety will be absolutely linked to legal procedures or legal development, human rights, or how human rights are embodied in the legislation of the country, and for sure race, gender will play a role there, that for sure. But the point here is not what the European Union think of what a safe country is, but how particular groups experience unsafety and risk. And this is when I want to recall what we already said, or what the panelists said. We need to listen to our other voices. That for me, that's essential. If I want to know what a safe place is, I need to pay attention on those people who are telling me this is not safe. And it doesn't mean that whoever speaks, they are right and nothing can be said about that. Of course, we need to, it's a dialogue, it's a construction. At the end, concepts are social constructions. So this is what I would say from a queer perspective when you try to queer concepts. It has to do with different voices. With what Joe spoke about, this symphony, where all the instruments need to play a role there. I think that this would be a good way to focus that. Thank you for me.
Any other comments, questions?
I just wanted to say that I was very much impressed by the German Consul General because he used very nice diplomatic language to express what the European Union should do when it meets its other states. Unfortunately, it's the High Representative who has done the bad job and told what the European Union is. It's not the job of the German Chancellor, it was the job of the High Representative. And that's what remains. It's official. It's a problem. And the other thing I'd like to say is nothing will make the European Union more successful than to take care of its internal politics and societies. The citizens, how they understand the relation with the European Union. If this happens, and understand the problems, always had so many financial crises, and before that, or even before and after that, we have migration crisis, and before that, we had the Yugoslav wars. Something comes up, but only if European Union manages to convince its citizens through policies and actions that is worth, I think will become a model for the rest. Whenever there are problems, and the entire European Union cannot convince its own people, then why the others have to be convinced? And it's not only the European Union, the United States faces a similar problem as well. That was an idea for many years. When things don't happen well, you're not anymore the model. So it's very imperative to address internal questions.
You want to finish on a pessimistic note?
European Union is a great thing. Zamonet was right.
If there are no other questions, let me thank you for your presentations, for your responsiveness to the questions, and for sharing, being so generous, sharing your research and your reaction to these interesting positions and questions. And please join me in giving a warm thank you.
Thank you for having